Hello and welcome to Spiritual Book Club. I'm Danny and I read a lot of books. So, back when I was in college biology, I was not too interested in everything we were learning. When we had to dissect the fetal pig, I plugged my nose. It was something that grossed me out for weeks, and so I was not very excited about learning about the basic function of human existence. However, I feel like I've caught up now that I've read this week's book, and that is Biology of Belief by Bruce Lipton. So, first, we're going to talk about the main thesis of this book. I'll say where it falls on my woo scale from 1 to 10, and then I'll read some of the quotes from the book that I thought were the most profound, and then I'll wrap up by talking about who this book is for, who should be reading Biology of Belief. All right, so if you don't know me, I'm Danny Fankhauser. I'm a spiritual coach for career up levels, and I work with astrology and Reiki and mindfulness, and I share how to find your soul path through this YouTube channel, through my one-on-one work, and through group meditations. All right, so let's get into it. So Bruce's main thesis in Biology of Belief, I've listened to him on a ton of podcasts, and I knew the assumption that he talked about if you change your beliefs, then you can change your life, which sounds very woo-woo. It falls right into all of the law of attraction and everything else in kind of the mystical realm. So I thought that that was what I would find in this book. I really think the thesis of the book is slightly different than that, though. He talks a lot more. It's a very sciencey book. And he goes very deep into like the science of a cell and the membrane and the different parts of a cell. And so what I thought was really the main thesis of this book was more epigenetics. And so basically when Bruce was coming up as a doctor and a scientist, there was just like widespread belief that our genes are determinary, and whatever genes we have will tell us what kind of diseases we're going to have, how happy we're going to be. Everything's just decided in the genes. And so he really goes into all the proof that that's not the case, that there can be change. So that does support, but it's still kind of a leap to say that what you believe changes your experience. But really, I think his main thesis is that the genes don't determine everything, that there's so much more in the environment, epigenetics, that changes your experience, that changes what kinds of health that you have and what kinds of life experiences that you have. And then there's a secondary thesis, which is really about the theory of evolution and how, although we credit Darwin with evolution, there was another scientist, Lamarck, who was even earlier, who had a very similar theory that didn't catch on, but that is probably more accurate. And rather than survival of the fittest, his theory was actually more about survival of collaboration and how groups collaborate. And so it's more the group survival versus the individual, which is something that more and more people are catching on to as maybe being more affirming, but also truly more accurate. So on the woo scale, this book, I would put it at a 5 out of 1 to 10 because it is absolutely filled with science. Bruce Lipton was a medical professor, medical school professor. So it's like reading a textbook almost. For me, it was like reading a textbook. But he also is making some very big claims. I think he calls it new science. He's really kind of like burning the house down of the science that he grew up with and saying that this is totally missing the mark and there's all of these other things. So very challenging in terms of science, and kind of he does make kind of a leap into his takeaway, which I'm going to talk about. So some of the main points he has are that the brain of the cell, so each cell is intelligent, so that's already a bold claim, but each cell is intelligent. The brain is not the nucleus in the center. We kind of assume that because we think of the brain being kind of the center of our head, I guess. But that the mind of the cell is actually the membrane on the outside, so the outer kind of shell or outer layer, and it decides what goes in and out. And so kind of the jump that he makes is that whatever the main function, the functions of the cell apply to the human as well. So each human is basically like a collective of cells, so to speak. So however cells function, then humans function that way too. And so he says like the cell's membrane, the outside, is deciding what goes in and out and deciding how the cell functions. And so for the human, that's our perception. And so it's, when he talks about environment, it's not really like, oh, you live in LA and you live in a difficult home versus you live in, a wealthy family in Tennessee or something like that. He's not talking about like the literal environment. He's saying it's your perception. Like, are you happy with everything around you? And so that's where he says that that plays into epigenetics. It's not your actual environment, though you could make a decision to move, but to move places or to change your situation. But he's really saying it's your perception of your environment that changes your inner functioning of your body. So there's also a very interesting part he talks about in the end that kind of, since I study energy healing, I found very, very interesting. He's saying each person's cell receptors are totally unique, and compares the body to a television set. So we think about like our fingerprints being unique and all of these other things about us, is each human totally unique? And so he's, again, very sciencey, but he's saying these cell receptors are, and so it's almost like the body is an antenna, and then the person is more like this ethereal being. And so it does play into, and that's why this does lean a little bit woo, the idea that a human could be born with the same cell receptors and then pick up like basically the identity of a soul that might have already lived in a human body at a different time. He doesn't quite go there. He doesn't quite say that, but his television set analogy definitely sets the platform for that kind of a concept. So I'm going to read some of the quotes that were the most impactful to me as I was reading. So he says, I had to conclude that the cell's operations are primarily modeled by its interaction with the environment, not its genetic code. There's no doubt that the DNA blueprints stored in the nucleus are remarkable molecules which have been accumulated over 3 billion years of evolution. But as remarkable as these DNA blueprints are, they do not control the operations of the cell. Logically, genes cannot pre-program a cell or an organism's life because cell survival depends on the ability to dynamically adjust to an ever-changing environment. The membrane's function of interacting intelligently with the cell environment to produce behavior makes it the true brain of the cell. So the takeaway there is by shifting your environment and by adjusting to your environment as a human as well as a cell is really the key. And then he says, I repeat this information from the first chapter because I want to emphasize, while it is the job of the membrane in a single cell to be aware of the environment and set in motion an appropriate response to the environment, in our bodies, those functions have been taken over by a specialized group of cells we call the nervous system. It is not a coincidence that the human nervous system is derived from the embryonic skin, the human counterpart of a cell's membrane. So he is coming up with kind of a logical flow to how, as a human, you operate as like basically a massive cell, but rather than the membrane being kind of that controlling intelligent factor, it's the nervous system. In my last video about trauma, I talk about the nervous system and how important that is. All right, and so this is my favorite because he does get into the idea of how someone's belief could quite literally change their health and their reality. Unfortunately, scientists most often deny rather than embrace exceptions. My favorite example of scientific denial of the reality of mind-body interactions relates to an article that appeared in Science magazine about 19th century German physician Robert Koch, who, along with Pasteur, founded the germ theory. The germ theory holds that bacteria and viruses are the primary cause of disease. A modified version of that theory is widely accepted now, but in Koch's day, it was more controversial. One of Koch's critics was so convinced that the germ theory was wrong that he brazenly wolfed down a glass of water laced with Vibrio cholerae, the bacterium Koch believed caused cholera. To everyone's astonishment, the man was completely unaffected by the virulent pathogen. The Science article published in 2000 describing the incident stated, "For unexplained reasons, he remained symptom-free, but nevertheless incorrect." So the man survived, and Science, reflecting the unanimous opinion on the germ theory, had the audacity to say his criticism was incorrect. If he claimed that this bacterium is the cause of cholera and the man demonstrates that he is unaffected by the germs, how can he be incorrect? Instead of trying to figure out how the man avoided the dreaded disease, scientists blithely dismiss this and other embarrassing, messy exceptions that spoil their theories. Remember the dogma that genes control biology. Here is another example in which scientists, bent on establishing the validity of their truth, ignore pesky exceptions. The problem is there cannot be exceptions to a theory. Exceptions simply mean a theory is not fully correct. All right, so if that got you excited, maybe this book is for you. This book is for you if you're a bit of a rebel and ready to prod and question modern science, if you feel like you're not getting the full truth, if you want to know more, if you want to know what's behind the curtain, so to speak, if you get excited by new ideas and challenging the status quo. It's definitely for someone who wants to establish a new worldview, who wants to be on the edge of what's coming out, and who's willing to kind of dive into the nitty-gritty of the science to really understand what's going on in the human body. So let me know in the comments if you've read this book, if I missed anything that you think is important to know about it, or let me know what you want to read next. Thank you for exploring the cosmos with me. This is Spiritual Book Club, and I hope to see you next time.